Hi, Christina.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy to have you. Let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright, and this is the Wright Show. You are Cristina Bicchieri,
Correct.
correct? Not a perfect pronunciation, but
Right.
adequate, we hope. And you are a professor at Penn, both in the philosophy and psychology departments, right?
Correct.
And for that matter, you're director of a couple of things there. You're director of what, the Laboratory for Behavioral Ethics, and
Yes, B-Lab, Behavioral Ethics Lab,
mhm.
and PPE, the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at Penn.
Okay, and you also you teach a Coursera course that will start another cycle on August 15th
Correct.
called Social Norms, Social Change.
Right.
And you've written a book about social norms called The Grammar of Society. Subtitle is The Nature and Dynamics of Social Norms. And what we're going to talk about today is social norms. And if I can just give a little definition of them that I'm sure won't pass muster with an academic and wouldn't comply with your formal definition. But the idea is that they are rules that you find in a society or in a group that people tend to comply with, but they're not laws. The kinds of norms we normally focus on are not actual laws, so there's no official enforcement, and yet people do follow these rules by and large, and that leads to certain patterns in society. And the more I thought about this as I was preparing for this and looking at your book, the more aware I became of how completely pervasive norms are. I mean, so many things that you read about in the news, when you read about, say, contact between the West and the so-called Muslim world, there's a lot about norms in there. I think this presidential election, in a way, is maybe more about norms than many presidential elections. And I want to ask you about that. But there are a lot of applications. You have been, I gather, enlisted by UNICEF to help them understand norms, things like genital mutilation. How do these norms arise? Why do they persist? So norms are all over the place. And I gather, I think this is in the preface of your book, that you became interested in norms partly because you have often found yourself living in a country that is foreign to you, right? And that makes you more aware of the norms.
Absolutely. 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 Yes.
And are there, did this start when you were a kid or what? This is mainly during your adult life you've traveled, or?
Um, the interest in norms actually is both practical and, as I said in the book, being in a really different countries, and norms, as you mentioned, are informal. So nobody gives you a book and tells you, oh, these are the rules you have to follow. You learn by looking at people, you learn by making mistakes, and in a sense, you're like a kid. Even if you are an adult in a foreign country, you have, to know the rules people go by, and you make mistakes and learn. And so there was a very practical interest, but also theoretical interest, because I have always been very, very keen on understanding, how, what makes for social order.
Mm-hmm.
How people can live together in a sort of cooperative environment, because even if there is conflict, in the end, there is a lot of cooperation that keeps society together, and social norms are one of these gluing, if you will, mechanism. So I always have also a theoretical interest in social norms.
Okay. Any mistakes that are particularly memorable in your life that haunt you to this day?
Yes.
maybe they haunt you so much you don't want to talk about them.
No. It's very interesting. Americans do not like conflict, open conflict, apparently. And I remember at my first faculty meetings, where I am with my colleagues, and as an Italian, we are accustomed to express our opinions, sometimes forcefully, and it means nothing. I mean, it's just a way of expressing what you think, and if you disagree, you show you disagree. And it really was, sort of, I won't say hurting people, but they were looking at me like.
What did you say things like, I think that's a bad idea?
Yes.
Yeah. As opposed to saying, there's a lot there that I like, but
I learned the lesson.
Yeah, I had to learn that one too. But because, there is difference within nations as well. And my parents were from West Texas. It was kind of a West Texas farm culture. And it's not like they were brash or anything, but they were pretty candid.
Yeah, but, in certain environments, especially academic environments, people are not that candid. They tend, conflict tend to be hushed and, not expressed that openly. And so at the beginning I had problems because of that.
Well, at least you weren't in Japan.
Oh, yes.
That would have been even harder.
And also, another thing that is very interesting, Americans have a certain physical space that they live between one and another, and Italians have less physical space. And so you see that, people get a little nervous when you start occupying that invisible perimeter.
So did you back people against walls at cocktail parties?
No, I don't. But I may come too close, and that was very clear. And of course, I changed my behavior.
Yeah. Okay. So, norms. First of all, do you think we've done a good enough job of defining them for practical purposes, or do you want to say anything more about what you mean by the term?
Oh, yes, I want to say what I mean, because, the literature on social norm is a vast literature. There is a lot written in sociology, social psychology, anthropology. But what made me wanting to write about norms and study norms is the fact that all these many definitions you find are not what I say operational. What do I mean by that? Are not definitions that allow you to measure norms, to decide, through surveys or other type of measures that, yes, I'm facing a social norm, or no, I'm facing a collective habit, a custom, or I'm facing a shared moral norms. These are very different things, and this difference matters a lot when you want to do an intervention, when you want to change things. If it is a custom, you do certain things. If it is a moral norm, it's a different story. If a social norm is another story. Yeah.
So a custom is a norm. It's just a particular type of norm. It's not a norm at all.
No, it's a collective, is a pattern of behavior that, a group shares. One interesting thing is, for example, open defecation, which is very common in most part of the developing world, is a custom. What do I mean by saying it's a custom? For example, people, of course, if you ask them, they expect other people to behave like that. But the question is, do these social expectations influence their choice? Is their behavior influenced by them? No. They do it anyway.
So for you, a prerequisite for calling something a norm is that people's compliance with it depends on their own assessment of its prevalence, of whether other people are going to comply?
Two things, if it is a social norm. One is, correct, their assessment about, how many people in my community that matter to me are complying with it. And, it must be a sizable number. And the second, which is very important, is what do these people think I ought to do? So it's what I call a normative expectation.
So there is concern about what people will think of you.
Yes, what they do and what they think I should do. Both things together, are very crucial for social norms, but there is a third element which is important. I must prefer to comply with the norm given these expectations, because I may have these expectations and say, but I don't care. Okay, they have no value for me, but in a social norm, these expectations play a causal role, basically. You know, they induce me to behave in a particular way, especially normative expectation, because obviously if people think that I should behave in a particular way, there will be sanctions if I don't, right?
Right. And the sanctions can come in the form of people's opinions of you. I mean, that's a kind of a sanction, is if they disapprove of you. But then also there are ways they can express the disapproval. They can not invite you to their parties. They can gossip about you.
I was going to say gossip is a big deterrent. You know, people think of punishment as something, you know, really major and serious. And, you know, of course, there are serious punishment like honor killing. You break the rule of honor, you know, you break the rule of purity, well, you get killed. But there are many other very milder punishments, like being gossiped about, okay, being disrespected, etc., that people care about.
And so I guess this is particularly true in cases where, at a level of self-interest, there would be motivation to violate the norm. That maybe that's not always the case, but a pretty broad category of norms is there's a temptation to violate them, but for whatever reason, maybe because compliance is good for the society, maybe for some other reason, but there is social pressure against the self-expression.
Very often, unless a norm is really internalized, and then it becomes a quasi-moral norm, it gets moralized. But usually, you know, social norms are not that much internalized. And certainly, you know, there is always a tension between my selfish desire to do something that's good for me at the moment and, you know, the collective benefits of doing something different. And social norms generally emerge just to solve this conflict.
And in your experience, I mean, how often is it that when you look at a norm, you think, yes, that does have a discernible function at the social level. It helps the group hang together or does something that needs doing at the group level. I mean, how often is that the case as opposed to it being just kind of a mystery as to how this thing got started? I mean, and maybe the thing that I think you've talked to UNICEF about, genital mutilation, maybe that's an example because it's not obvious what good that does at a social level.
That's very interesting. There are two stories about the emergence of norms. One is the story I was just telling. You know, there is a conflict between the social and the individuals, and then a norm will emerge to solve the conflict in favor of the social, of the community. But there are lots of other cases in which norms emerge out of conventions. Okay? And so suppose that female genital cutting was a conventional thing. They call it actually the pharaonic cut because it was in ancient Egypt there was genital cutting.
Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that word has survived in the cultures in Africa that do it?
Yes.
Wow.
It's very interesting. And there are cultures in which it never existed and now they are doing it. Okay, and other cultures in which it existed and it has been abandoned. But the interesting thing, when a convention takes up an extra meaning, becomes symbolic of something, becomes a signal, let's say, of belonging to a group, a signal of identity, of group identity, then it starts becoming a social norm. Okay, then you get punished if you don't follow it. So something that emerges as a pure convention may in time become a really strong social norm because it acquires a meaning. It signals something which is important for the group. So
you mean when it was a convention, you would say that at that stage there's not much actual pressure for compliance, it's just kind of happening? But once there is pressure, then you're calling it a norm?
Absolutely. When it is a convention, you know, you want maybe to imitate the powerful, to imitate people who do that are higher up in society or whatever. And if you don't do that, it's not that they punish you. You know, you may feel out of the group, basically. You may feel inadequate, but it's a purely personal thing. When it becomes a social norm instead, you have to do it. You have to do it. And if you don't do it, there will be dire consequences. Mm-hmm. So this is the big difference. So there is a punishment coming from the group in a social norm. When you are in a convention, in a sense, you punish yourself not doing what other people do. But it's not that they care or that they want you to do that.
Okay. Now, in this case, my guess had always been that this arose as a way for men, probably powerful men, to control the sexuality of women to their own kind of reproductive advantage. And the pharaoh is a perfect example. I mean, in ancient times, kings and pharaohs had harems of women, and they actually worked hard to make sure the women weren't having sex with anyone else. And that's why in some cases, you had
eunuch.
Exactly, eunuchs were the ones in charge of controlling them, because you didn't have to worry about them cheating with a eunuch. Yeah. And so, I would think that another way you could control the behavior of a woman is to make sex not very fun for her, right?
Absolutely. But there is cut and cut. There are minor cuts and there are major things like infibulation. So there is a big difference there. Okay.
I see. And both kinds are found in Africa today, and it varies by society or varies within society?
It varies by ethnic group, because African countries are basically places where there are many, many different ethnic groups, as I realized. They speak different languages, okay? When African states were formed by the French or the English, the colonial powers, they draw, the state without taking that much into consideration the ethnic and tribal nature of these people. And so you can find in a state like Nigeria, you can find tens of different ethnic groups with different traditions, different norms, different languages, etc. So that's what's happening.
And you said that when something really becomes a marker of a society, kind of a hallmark of a society, then there's more pressure to comply, and it's in a sense more firmly entrenched. And I guess that tells you something about, or does it tell you something about how you should and should not go about trying to change norms in another culture? Because sometimes when outsiders preach to a culture, that is taken as antagonistic. Yes. And actually raises the value internally of the thing that's being criticized, right?
I think this is a very good point, and you always have to be careful and very respectful of the culture you're dealing with. And one way, for example, suppose that within a culture, female genital cutting is very much related to concept of virtue, honor, purity, etc. And you are not going to question these basic values that people have. It would be a big mistake. What you're trying to do, and this has been done in Sudan very successfully actually, is called the Salima campaign. What they did was not question the basic values of the culture, but try to convince people that there are better ways to support those values. Okay? And they even use the word Salima, that means whole, pure, as God made you. Okay? To avoid the cutting. They say the cutting is sort of a violation of what God did, how he made the woman pure, untouched, uncut, etc. And they were very successful. Mm-hmm. And again, they never question concept of virtue, purity, and honor. They're still there.
And I guess it matters very much who is delivering the message, right? I mean, is this person perceived as an outsider, but also what kind of person is it within a society? It's like, there's always, as on the whole war on terror front, there's always a lot of complaining that, certain Muslim leaders aren't denouncing thoroughly enough certain kinds of behaviors. And I always wonder, are the kinds of people who are doing these behaviors, do they care about these particular Muslim leaders? I mean, to them, these Muslim leaders are the enemy, right? In some cases. So,
yeah, is a good point. First of all, whoever delivers this message must be part of the community, must be trusted. Okay, this is very, very important, because if you or I go, or foreign organization goes, there is a lot of suspicion. For example, there are places where they stop vaccinating children because they feel it's an American, plot to make us sterile, something like that. And, it's very hard, to change these kind of beliefs. So it has to come from within. It has to come from a very trusted person. And one thing that I want to add is that the trusted person is walking a fine line. Because if you're trusted in a community, you will not, you will risk a lot, let's say, if you go to the community with a message which is completely alien, completely different, not very acceptable. Okay, so you may lose the trust of the community. And so it's very important, as I said before, the message must be delivered by somebody within the community, somebody they trust, but at the same time, the message should never put into question the basic values and tenets of the community. And nobody better than a member of the community who is highly trusted could do that.
Okay. Now, there's another case you've written about and talked about, I think, where there's an attempt to change the behavior that has kind of contrary results because people don't, or could have contrary results, I think you're warning. It's the case of drinking on campus. These campaigns that begin by saying, drinking on campus is an epidemic. Over drinking on campus is an epidemic. Here's the percentage of students who have passed out while drinking and so on. How can that kind of backfire?
Well, it backfires because if I tell you a majority of people is doing XYZ, and this has been done with hazing, for example, people will start thinking it's normal behavior. Everybody does that. What's wrong with it? It's almost a permission to do that. Oh, it's okay.
Yeah, because in your model, I think there's two, and this is part of your definition of normal mode, there's two primary things that are determining compliance. One is fear of, opinion, sanction, whatever, but the other is just the observation of how prevalent it is. The more prevalent it is, the more likely you are to comply, to fall in line.
Absolutely. And I did some studies, some empirical, lab studies of what happens when the empirical goes in one direction. So you're told, oh, most people drink, or most people practice hazing, etc. And then you have a normative message that say, you should not do this, you should not do that. The normative message loses all power. Okay? Because when people see that the majority of people, this is very important with corruption. I do some consulting on corruption in African countries, and corruption is widespread, and people know that. Okay? And then if you send the message about it is widespread, the only result you get is making people more comfortable with it. Okay? Because, I know there are laws against corruption, but are they going to catch me? Are they going to punish me? Everybody's doing that.
Right. Yeah. Apparently you can get away with it if everyone's doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's very, very important. And another message which can be dangerous is a moralizing message. So if I go around and tell people it is really wrong to do that, what is the underlying message I get is, well, if you have to tell me that, it means a lot of people are doing it. Okay, so there are two kinds of messages that are very, very dangerous. One is high frequency of bad behavior, and the other is the moralizing message that make me infer that the bad behavior is pretty frequent if you have to convince me, to do otherwise.
Now, in my lifetime, a number of norms have changed, and in some cases, it's interesting. The law winds up playing a kind of a role? In other words, eventually laws start changing too, and it's hard to separate cause and effect. So a good example is cigarette smoking. I mean, I remember when, you'd go to a basketball game, you'd go to in an airplane. There was a no smoking section. Yeah. Like a lot of good that did, right? Like as if that kept the the smoke from entering the no smoking section. But it was just everywhere. Smoking was just everywhere, and now it's become very uncommon. And part of it is kind of normative in the sense that we mean people in certain, at least in certain socioeconomic demographics, will look at you askance if you smoke. But also laws have changed in all of these realms, in basketball arenas, in airplanes, even in the public parks in New York. And so it must be hard to disentangle, like, how, and then there was actual evidence involved, but it must be hard to, come up with a clear model in those cases.
Oh, it is interesting. I mean, we have a lot of evidence that law per se does not change behavior. And this happens especially in developing countries where you have certain norms that are very well established, like genital cutting or child marriage, and then you have laws against them. And if the law, and this has been studied by legal scholars, if the law is very much far away from the norm, from what people really do and normally do and most people do, is not going to be followed. So the law has to be, in a sense, closer to the norm to have an effect. Okay? In the case of smoking, I think the law followed, a new norm that was emerging, in which basically people start realizing not just that smoking is bad for my health, but that I am imposing a negative effect on other people, the so-called passive smoker. That at that point felt entitled to ask you, please don't smoke in front of me. You are imposing, a bad effect on me. You're imposing what we call a negative externality. And I think the law followed that. Mm-hmm. So it's not that the law was there and then we start, changing behavior. Behavior was changing because of all the information we got about passive smoking. I think the story about the bad effect of passive smoking was the most relevant thing. It's not telling people you can get cancer, etc. It's a very personal decision. Well, maybe I don't care, etc. But when you realize that you may, cause bad health consequences, bad health effects for, somebody else, a third party, a child, or somebody living with you, then it's a different story. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the important element that led to a change, and then the law followed.
Including the actual evidence about effects on
absolutely
third-party people. And although sometimes eventually the law kind of seems to run ahead of the evidence. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that in Central Park, right, if someone is smoking 15 feet away from you, sitting on their own little blanket, that really is an appreciable...
Oh, no. And people keep smoking. I mean, you see a lot of people smoking in a park, in a street, etc. But if they smoke nearby me, I tell you, I feel entitled to say, excuse me. Mm-hmm. I have a new entitlement I didn't have 20 years ago. Mm-hmm.
So you're saying even if it's legal, even if they're outdoors where it's legal to smoke, you would point out that they're too close to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
And people would feel entitled, and people would probably respond by, getting further away. Mm. Yes, I think so.
But in New York now, in Central Park, it's actually illegal to smoke a cigarette.
That's fine. But apart from legal or illegal, I think that the fact that we are very conscious of the negative effect that somebody smoking can have on me, and makes me entitled to tell him, please don't smoke in front of me. Please don't smoke nearby me. Mm-hmm. And the law is just following that. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the law per se caused this strengthen this reaction. But once it is common knowledge that passive smoking is extremely negative, then I think that people feel entitled to reproach the smoker.
Yeah.
Okay?
I've kind of wondered, this isn't that relevant, but whether in the case of Central Park and the New York parks, there's a second function being served that's desirable from the point of view of some people, which is to exclude certain demographics. You know, smoking cigarettes is still fairly prevalent at lower income levels, and you know, it's not a neutral law in that sense, in terms of who it is and isn't going to discourage from spending a couple of hours in Central Park. But maybe I'm getting a little too Marxist here.
I think you see. I don't think that even if the effect may be that it may discourage some people from being there, I don't think that it was the goal.
I doubt it was the conscious goal. At the same time, you know, I don't know. There's a kind of like, you know, Mayor Bloomberg was behind this, and there's a kind of like, you know, why can't everyone be like me? I live clean. I'm this. I'm that. You know, there's a, you know, I don't know. I won't get too far into this.
Well, it can, in a park, smoking has two negative consequences. One is not very nice to see, you know, all the spent cigarettes around, which is very unsightly. And the second is, in especially dry season, it may be dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I guess in a way, a point in the favor of my argument is that Bloomberg, I think, manifestly did go beyond the concern for second order effects in the legislation regarding, you know, soda pop, right? I think there was some kind of thing they passed in New York that made it harder to sell, like Coca-Cola in large volume, whether it was, I don't know, it was theaters or something. And that is, you know, that's not about the effect on the person next to you, right? That's about... Now, you could argue, using your model, that the more prevalent something is, the more likely other people are to adopt it. So you could argue that there are those kinds of second-order effects, I guess.
Yes. And the problem is that it can be debated whether this type of intervention is really patronizing, okay, and it denies people the freedom, okay, to drink as much sodas as they want, etc., etc. The other side would say, okay, in this way we are preventing people from having, you know, free huge beverages that damage their health, basically. So there are two sides to the debate. Lots of people see as a violation of freedom.
Now, another norm that has changed a lot since I was a kid is norms about, you know, kind of expressed opinions about, well, in a way, expressed opinions about sexuality generally. It was certainly a more conservative environment. I mean, you know, on the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was a comedy show here in the United States, Rob and Laura Petrie, even though they were married, they were not allowed to sit on the same bed when they were fully clothed, okay? That's how strict things... I know, it was probably never like that in Italy, but it was like that in the...
It was.
It was that bad?
This is a Catholic country, and, you know, until the sexual revolution, it was, if you will, of the late 60s, it was a very traditional country in sexual mores, yes.
Okay. And then there's also... you know, homosexuality and the expressed, what used to be, the expression of disapproval for that used to be common, not to mention a lot of slurs, the use of a lot of slurs. That's changed radically. And it's another case where the law kind of eventually followed. There are now hate speech laws, I guess, and whatever.
I think this is a very interesting example, gay marriage, okay, and the law supporting it, allowing it, etc. And the question is, how come in so few years you get, you know, on the one hand, a very strong anti-homosexual sentiment, and now we have gay marriage being supported, etc., etc. And I think that the television had a role. You know, when you see these people are normal. Could be my brother, could be my son, and also the AIDS crisis was very important because it made very clear, on the one hand, that these people could be my family. On the other hand, that very famous people were gay. Okay, and so sort of opened opened up, and opened a debate, if you will, a discussion of something that was not spoken about. Okay, and normalized it. I think the normalization is a very important thing. That when it is normalized, then lots of things, good thing in this case, can happen.
Yeah. And I think there was kind of a positive feedback cycle because as more gay people came out of the closet, more people realized they already knew a gay person who was a friend. And so their attitude toward homosexuality changed, and that enabled or encouraged more gay people to come out of the closet, and it was just like a cascade.
Yes, it's like a bandwagon effect. Yes, and it has been very, very important. And that's why when people ask me, how come that in so few years you have, from hostility to homosexuality, these laws supporting gay marriage, I just say what you're saying. There was really a normalization and bandwagon effect. Yeah.
Now, at some point, norms, when they're changed, it seems like they pick up elite support, or elites start deciding to encourage them. So you get like movies made like Brokeback Mountain and NPR. I have a friend, and she's like a liberal, so she wasn't like freaked out about this, but she was out of the country for a few years. And then she came back last year and she's like, what's all the LGBT stuff? She's like, I can't turn on NPR without hearing, a gay or trans person like sympathetically depicted, and there. So it does. You've talked earlier about how you have to be careful. Moral exhortation can backfire, but at the same time, sometimes elites.
It can be good.
It can work.
Is the other way around. On the one hand, what I said was related to bad behavior, let's say corruption, bribing, etc. The more, or drinking in college, the more people do that, the more you feel safe in numbers, basically doing it. But also the opposite can happen, and very nicely, about behavior that you want to support. And letting people know how frequent really a behavior is, how many, gay people there are around that you didn't suspect were gay, may, again, as I said, normalize it, but in a positive way. So in both cases, you have a normalizing effect. But in the gay people case, it's a very good one. They get accepted more easily.
And in a way, this is related to something that's been called the gentling of society. I think it's associated with a social scientist named Elias, or Elias, who studied norms. And his model, when I say that this is in a way connected to the gentling of society, bullying, which when I was young was just a fact of life. It's like we don't like bullies, but they will always be with us. Now I see signs in my neighborhood, like at the elementary school, like we're going to have an event, an anti-bullying event, like all the people against bullying are going to get together and rally. This goes all the way back to like dueling was once accepted. It's no longer accepted. There are various kind of brutal things that become less accepted over time. And I think this guy, Elias, his model of how this happens is that it was very elite driven, right, in general?
Yes, this very interesting book called The Court Society, in which he explains how modern good manners, and way to eat, way to stay at a table, way to behave, etc. He explained it as, some conventions that are born out of a certain group, in this case, a very privileged, high-level group that could afford a fork and a spoon and a knife, for example, and how these using of these particular tools becomes a symbol of high birth, And so it becomes a signal of I am a member of the upper crust of the high society. And then, as it always happens, then people at a lower level want to imitate them. And sooner or later, you have a sort of movement toward, adoption of the same manners, the same tools, etc., etc. But at the very beginning, what it shows is that it is a sign of belonging to a very exclusive and unique group. And so, yes, there is this element too.
So that has to do more with table manners. I was thinking more, I may have this wrong, exactly what his argument was, but there is, in any event, an emphasis on how a kind of refinement comes about that's very much elite-driven and has to do with, in general, the desire of people, I guess, to be thought of as high status, or their tendency to use high status people as role models, at least the high status people within the group that they consider themselves part of. So when I said at the outset that I thought this presidential election was more about norms than some, I had in mind some of the stuff we've been talking about, right? Like speech codes, having to do with homosexuality, or the way we can talk about ethnic groups, the way we can talk about Muslims, African Americans, and so on. It seems to me that a lot of Donald Trump's support it's not about policies per se. There are some public policies he talks about, but a lot of the energy comes from their saying we're fed up with these norms that govern speech.
I completely agree, and this is what's happening really in a very similar way in Europe, where you have Marine Le Pen, you have the Northern League in Italy, etc. They are all anti-immigration, anti-multicultural society, basically inclusion, etc., etc. And it's interesting because on the one hand, you have the traditional parties that are, in some sense, that adopt certain norms of, not being inclusive, not being a racist, being this and being that, norms of good behavior, if you will. And people, lots of people, and I can speak for Europe too, I just coming back from Europe, lots of people feel threatened, especially in Europe with immigration, but also in America with all, the terrorist attacks, etc. They feel threatened. And when people feel threatened, certain norms of good, civilized behavior go out of the window. And I think Trump and Marine Le Pen and people like them, there is a certain similarity because they are basically banking on people's fear. Okay? And when people fear, they are really ready to accept certain behavior and certain statement that they would not normally accept in a moment of peace, when they are at ease, when they are not feeling bad or threatened by something. So I don't think that, Europeans that have always been, very welcoming to immigration. We have, for, a long, long time, had immigrants. There was absolutely all the discussion of being tolerant and integrating them was very much related to this immigration. And this you see in a few years, how this fear of this enormous wave of immigration from Muslim countries, how this has changed people's mind. It's just amazing. So it's more an issue of fear. Certain norms, in some sense, I hate to say that, but I think in some sense, certain norms are a luxury that you can afford when you're not threatened, when you're not fearful. Okay? And what Trump is doing is exactly saying, well, they are a luxury. We can't have them. Okay?
Now, in the case of Trump supporters, and this is probably somewhat true in Europe, I mean, this is part of it, new threats. I think in the case of Trump supporters, the threat, it's not just immigrants who, well, in both cases, in Europe and the United States, there's also the threat, the perceived threat to employment, right? There are competitors for jobs, right. That's the perception, and that drives some of this. And then there's the terrorism, and that drives some of it. There's all that. There is also, so that's about fear in some sense or another. I think there's also things that are not so. For example, the way men are allowed to talk about women, or in fact, Trump himself is on record. You know, there are recordings of him talking to, you know, a disc jockey or something about women in what would be considered a crude way in polite society. You know, evaluating women as sex objects and so on. And that's a case where I don't know if the resentment has been simmering for a long time and is finally finding expression, you know, because that's a case where the norms did kind of change. It used to be, you know, 30, 40 years ago, it was more acceptable to evaluate a woman as a sex object, and maybe for a woman to evaluate a man as a sex object. I'm not so sure about that, but the norms have changed, and I can't figure out whether, you know, there's been this slowly growing resentment to them that is finally finding expression or what.
I don't think I would look at it like that. I think that especially at lower income levels, where man was traditionally the breadwinner, and man is no longer traditionally the breadwinner. You know, I saw the statistics. There are many cases in which women went back to work and find job more easily than men. Mm-hmm. Okay, and this has led to a mismatch in values, basically. Mm-hmm. Okay, so women are breadwinners; they are more independent, and for men, traditional men that belong to a certain social class, if you will, okay, it's very difficult to accept that. Okay, so there is a backlash, but not everywhere. I think there is a backlash in all the situations where the role of man is threatened. The role of man as breadwinner, as the guy who provides for the family, is threatened. And the woman is now providing, and this in their mind is humiliating, is bad. So I think that this backlash is partial, is related to a certain part of the population that had more traditional, if you will, and more traditional views, and these traditional views are put into question in a very quick and damaging way for them. Okay. So okay. I would read it like that.
So this is another case of a perceived threat, like the xenophobia case, in your view.
Yes. I think that one of the important elements that you always have to consider is, do people feel threatened? Do people feel there is a menace to your life, to their identity? This is very important. Mm-hmm. This is very important, and I think we should understand that, especially in the case, even in the case of women, not just immigration, but in the case of women. And again, it's not everybody. It's just the people who are actually threatened, okay, that will react that way.
There is, in your work, there's a fascinating concept that I think may be relevant to all this, and I'll explain why. But it's the concept of pluralistic ignorance. You want to explain what that is?
Yes. Pluralistic ignorance is a situation in which we observe other people's behavior. So you know what other people are doing, how they are behaving in specific situation. And the problem is there is no transparent communication. There is no possibility of telling each other, I like or dislike this behavior. I agree, I support, or I don't support it. Okay? So it is a situation, is typical of certain social norms that survive even if most people dislike them. And what sort of situation is this? On the one hand, you see people behave in the norm appropriate way. On the other hand, you don't like it. but there is no transparent communication. No transparent communication often means that you feel that voicing your dissent would put you at a disadvantage. Mm-hmm. And this is typical of small, close-knit communities, for example, that have been studied in this respect. And another very important thing is a psychological bias, according to which when you observe people behaving in a particular way, the typical inference that people draw is that these people support this behavior. They are not like me, dissenting but keeping their mouth shut, but they support it. So if you put together these three elements, observability, so you do social comparison, you see other people that live nearby that matter to you behaving in a certain way. Second, no transparent communication. Third, you interpret their behavior as a sign that they endorse it, they support it, then you have pluralistic ignorance.
Okay, so
it's damaging.
So an example you use in your work is the Emperor's New Clothes, where everybody is acting as if the Emperor has new clothes, and each individual person assumes that everyone else really believes that the Emperor has new clothes.
Not just believes, sees them.
Sees them, right. It's like, I don't see them, but there must be something wrong with me. So in the case of kind of more conventional norms, it would be like, somebody saying, well, I don't see anything wrong with referring to an ethnic group some way, but nobody else does, so probably nobody else agrees with me.
Absolutely.
And one thing I'm wondering is whether some of what we're seeing lately could have to do with the way new information technologies make it easier to get in touch with people who share your opinion. So you realize there are more people who share your opinion out there, even if they're all the way across the country or something. And so you get a little rebellion against some little bit of a speech code or something. Does that make sense? So these are technologies that dispel pluralistic ignorance.
It makes a lot of sense. The fact that the new internet, using internet, websites, etc., where you can find, first of all, you can find dissenters like you, okay? In a small, close-knit community, you can find them. But in the larger, let's say, internet community, you certainly can find them. Mm-hmm. And what is studied, and is very interesting, you see the formation of networks of similarly minded people that create their own group, basically. Mm-hmm. And you see that over the internet very often this happens, okay? And so what you say is that the fact that we have all these new tools at our disposal is certainly very important in, if you will, eliminating or dampening, at least, pluralistic ignorance. Because, yes, I won't tell you how I feel, but A, I find out that there are many people that feel like me, and so I can become more openly rebellious. Yes, mm-hmm. This is clearly an advantage, if you will, of information technology.
Okay, and then my final theory about Trumpism is just that, as you said, elites, in a certain sense, always carry influence, but it's a question of who you define as an elite, a legitimate elite. So like Donald Trump's followers consider him a legitimate elite. If he comes out and says, hey, you're going a little too far here, probably a lot of them would comply with his guidance, whereas if you or I said it, they wouldn't. And one thing I'm wondering is it the case that like the large body of Americans used to look at kind of the elite establishment, the people who run the TV networks and the politicians and so on, and go, yeah, they're legitimate elites. And for whatever reason, like maybe because of the perception that, wait a second, we're no longer being served economically by this system, or maybe because there's no Soviet Union out there to be a threat that unifies, for whatever reason, a lot of people are deciding that, no, actually the elite establishment just doesn't deserve my respect.
I think there is a lot of these feelings also in Europe towards like traditional political parties, traditional intellectual elites. The fact that people start started feeling they do not represent me. They do not do anything for me. Okay, and in this sense, they become delegitimized. Yes, this is what's happening. And is very interesting. The Trump phenomenon, that I repeat, is a phenomenon not just here, but is very similar to what's happening in Europe, because what you have is a rejection of traditional parties. The Five-Star Movement in Italy, which won a great majority of the local elections, okay, against the dominant parties, against the parties in power, is exactly an example of people feeling you're not serving my interests, okay? Mm-hmm. And Trump is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as somebody who's going to serve the interest of, the sort of men of the street, basically, mm-hmm. the typical American, etc. Something that the Republican Party is not doing anymore, because they have become very ideological, very embroiled in their ideological fights. And Trump, there is another interesting thing about him, speaks a very simple language. Mm-hmm. It's very simple, it's very clear, okay? And we may laugh at that, but it's very effective.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, the Republican Party has actually, for some time, encouraged their base to resent certain kinds of elites. I mean, there's been a big thing going back decades to Dan Quayle, at least, to kind of to demonize these so-called cultural elites, these liberal cultural elites. And in a way, I think it's almost as if that was a way to distract them from the fact that the Republicans actually weren't serving their economic interests all along. It's like, but we are with you in this war against the liberal elites. But now, sadly, for the Republican Party, the definition of elites to resent is getting broader.
Exactly. I agree. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, because we had a somewhat similar issue in Europe with the left and the right, etc. And now they are both the enemy, the traditional right, not Marine Le Pen or people like that, but the sort of traditional more conservative parties out, okay, mm-hmm. together with the leftists. Neither of them has served our interests. That's what people are thinking. Mm-hmm. And that's why there is this incredible emergence of alternative figures and alternative groups. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's amazing.
So before we go, I'd like you to give us a little bit of a flavor of your kind of formal academic work. I mean, again, if people are interested in this, as they should be, they can sign up for your Coursera course, which is free, Coursera.org, Coursera.org. If they just Google your name in Coursera, or just Google your first name in Coursera and norms even, they'll get to the course. Yes. And it starts August 15th. But can you give us a sense of what kinds of issues arise? Now, I know you have used game theory to model the development of norms and so on, but are there particular issues where you are in disagreement with some other school of thought, or even some large school of thought or anything? What do you feel yourself as kind of battling for in the realm of normative theory?
Well, first of all, a completely different theory of norms. As I said, an operational one in which I present very simple concepts, and I say you can do everything with these 3 or 4 concepts that are measurable. So we can do experiments, we can do survey. There is a part of my Coursera in which I deal with measurement, okay, how to measure things, etc., which is something that you don't commonly find in discussions of social norms. And because I give measurement, I also give diagnostic tools, especially when you want to do intervention and you want to understand, what sort of behavior is this? What motivates people to do this or that? Well, I give you tools to diagnose what it is. Okay? Is it a collective habit? Is it a moral rule? Is it a social norm? Once you know that, and again, I give you tools to measure these things. Once you know that, you can intervene. And I'm finishing the second part of the Coursera that will be available probably in September. And this second part is all about change. So the first part is all diagnostic and measurement, and the second part is change. How we induce change, how change can happen, what sort of tools we can use to change things. So there are two very important parts that are separated.
So it sounds like you think that the study of norms is more amenable to rigorous, in some cases, quantitative treatment than it's been given credit for.
Absolutely, absolutely. The previous definition, where, they capture certain elements like social sanctions, the informality, the fact that they are shared rules, true. But my question is, how can you very precisely define them in a way in which you can measure, and by measuring decide which is which and change them? Mm-hmm. Because it's very difficult to change something if you don't have a theory about it, or you can't measure. You can't even measure if you try to change. You can't even understand, has there been change or not? Who knows? Okay.
So people can find more on this in your Coursera course. Also in your book, The Grammar of Society, which I guess refers to the fact that, a grammar is implicit in a language. Although now we have rules of grammar, that's not how grammar's developed. They were informal, implicit parts of language, and of course now people come and study them and say, oh, this seems to be the rule that's operating here, but they're actually hidden sources of structure, like norms.
Absolutely. I say the grammar of society exactly because norms sort of regulate social life. Implicit, like grammar rules. Of course we can study grammar rules, but while you and I talk, we use grammar rules. We implicitly know grammar rules, but it's not that now I start writing down what sort of grammar rules I'm using or not, grammar or syntactic rules. And the same is with social norms. They are at the basis, the basic rule, the basically web that keeps society together. And it is very much informal, unspoken, but we all know what they are. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to mention that I have a new book which is coming out with Oxford University Press, and it's called Norms in the Wild: How to Diagnose, Measure, and Change Social Norms. And my Coursera is somewhat based on that. The book is, of course, richer and more complex because it's a book, but is very much tied to my experience with UNICEF, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation. I also work for the Gates Foundation, and I do a lot of consulting on social norm. There is an enormous interest in not just social norm per se, but in how to measure them. Mm-hmm. Because and in my consulting work, I do a lot of measurement, basically. Okay. And I have developed a particular type of surveys, vignettes, etc. that I use. Then we can decide what's the best intervention for that situation. But if you don't know what the situation is or what motivates people to behave as they do, right, intervention may be very, very inefficient or not efficacious.
So the next book is about how you really carry these tools into real life, different cultures, somewhat in the spirit of anthropology, I guess.
Yes, somewhat.
more quantitative and so on. But anthropologists, God knows, they've studied norms.
But I use a lot of examples that I learned about in my training, because I've done Penn UNICEF training for quite a few years on social norm and social change. And so I got all these people coming from all over the developing world with a lot of issues and problems, from child marriage, to female genital cutting, to open defecation. So there are lots and lots of issues that they have been dealing with. And I learned from them a lot. Mm-hmm. And what I learned, I put in this book.
And when's the book coming out?
The book is coming out, I think, in November.
Oh, So maybe can people already pre-order it on Amazon?
I think you can pre-order with Oxford. Yes, yes.
Okay.
But if you go to Coursera, I got the permission to put chapters of my book there.
Oh, good.
Okay. So you will see that there is something already there, so you can read it as as you follow Coursera.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Cristina. This has been very illuminating, and good luck with the Coursera course.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.